Hello, everyone. I'm Ruba Abeid, and this is the Marginalized Notes podcast. Today, I'm actually in a conquering mission. I've taken over Mazen's throne to present this podcast to you today. However, since we are the Marginalized Notes podcast, there's actually no thrones in the margins. They're paradoi thrones. It belongs to everyone. Today, our guest is a very interesting person. I'm very excited to have him with us. He's an anthropologist. He holds a PhD in anthropology from Johns Hopkins University, and he's currently doing his postdoctoral fellowship at Leibniz-Zentrum Moderner Orient in Berlin. His research interests roam around the topics of difference and non-Western epistemologies, specifically in Palestine and Jordan and the rest of the region. I'm very happy to have you here with us, Arpan Roy.
Thank you very much for having me. It's truly an honor and a pleasure.
Well, speaking of the thrones and margins, and looking at the current state of the world today, well, it's an absolute mess, of course, but a big reason why it is an absolute mess has to do with the history of the modern world, where there is thrones in certain geographies and margins in others. And recently, especially with what has been happening last year, we have been, at least in the media, we have been hearing this term much more often, the label of the global south, referring to the margins of the world. I'd like to hear from you. What does it actually mean?
It's a very interesting question and a complex question. So first of all, I will say that it exists. And you see it in all kinds of political situations. For example, how countries vote in the UN. We saw it not just with this Palestine issue, but also with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How the world basically voted on sanctions against Russia was also very much divided along these, with some exceptions, this global north, global south divide. I would like to say that the global south is a structure of feeling. It's an affective reality, but it has a material genealogy. It really goes back to the 1950s and 1960s, when the world was quite different, mostly in the sense that the liberal democracies, the capitalist liberal democracies, which we today take for granted, only constituted about half the world, which is kind of difficult to imagine today. 1/3 of the world was either the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc, the countries that were economically or militarily aligned with the Soviet Union. The other third were the so-called non-aligned countries. But in fact, they were closer to the Soviet sphere of influence than the American one. And so this American-led world was the first world. The Soviet-led world was the second world, and the non-aligned world was the third world. And then through the development of economics discourse, this third world got rebranded as the global south. However, something very interesting happened after the Chinese Revolution, where there was this Chinese-Soviet split in different ideas of communism. The Chinese said, actually, the Soviet Union behaves like an imperialist power, just like the US does. So there's no difference between them. So the three worlds collapsed into two worlds. And what we have today with this global north and global south divide is the inheritance of the Chinese version of the three worlds theory, right? And so basically it places the industrialized, wealthy countries in one block and the poorer, less industrialized countries in the second world. But if you look closely at this makeup, it's full of contradictions. So for example, Pakistan was militarily and economically allied with the United States throughout the whole Cold War. Is Pakistan not a part of the global south? The Bandung Conference in 1955, which is when really the non-aligned movement took shape, no Latin American country was invited to the Bandung Conference. Is Latin America not part of the global south? So it's exactly a scientific thing, but there is a structure of feeling and affect that connects. For example, many people from the global south feel an affinity with Japan, for example, even though Japan is wealthier than many European countries. So it cannot be scientifically kind of defined. But I will say, though, that what I like to take from this idea of the global south goes back to this pre-Chinese version of it, the three worlds theory, which is this spirit of free critique or the spirit of autonomy, where you have the first world and you have the second world, the American world, the Soviet world, and this other world that says, actually, we'd rather do our own thing. We don't want either of you.
Well, with all of this very thick context, how would looking to the world through this labor is actually useful? Like what use does it give us, considering this affective energy around understanding our reality being a global south? How does it help with assuming or thinking about potential change or reclaiming reality?
I think it helps us learn from each other's experiences. For example, the experience of colonialism, which was very different in different parts of the world. But I think there is a lesson to be learned. I'm often frustrated when, for example, the image of India in the contemporary post-colonial world or the colonized world like Palestine is not the image of the decolonial movement or the anti-colonial movement or the anti-colonial uprisings. It's much more a romanticized vision of India for yoga and so forth. But actually, there's a very serious lesson of anti-colonial uprising and organizing to be learned from India. My favorite Indian post-colonial thinker is Ashish Nandi, who in the 1980s and 1990s wrote some very interesting books about colonialism. And he said his teachers, I mean, not actual teachers, he never studied with them, but he learned from them through books, were the African anti-colonial thinkers or African origin. And so Senghor in Senegal, or somebody like Fanon, who, African origin, but then he worked in Algeria. Although the Algerian experience of colonialism and the Indian were very different, and the Senegalese were very different, there is a shared affect that we were, we had this experience together and we can learn from it. And I think this is the value that this idea of a global South has. For me, anyway, it's not just replacing the global North with the global South. There are some instances in the, in the US, you hear from time to time, some college professor will, they will teach non-Western epistemologies and they will teach a philosophy class, for example, without the Greeks, without Plato, and they'll all, have all global South thinkers or, Black feminist philosophers and so forth. To me, this is not the point to kind of inverse history. But what is interesting for me from this free critique that I was talking about, this position of autonomy, is to put Ibn Khaldun alongside Marx or Ibn Rushd alongside Plato, not replace Marx with Ibn Khaldun, but to take them seriously as equals. And I think this is what this global South autonomous free critique can really offer.
It doesn't kind of put us in danger of looking at the global South as a collective, as something that unites all of these nations together, just because they have been victimized in a way or another through a very complex history.
Yes, there is a danger of homogenization, for sure. But also, if you look at the history of, as I was saying a little while ago, how this developed under very materialist circumstances, there was a need to have a bloc, to have political representation, to have a voice. And we see it also today with this, with the so-called BRICS countries and the BRICS formalizing as an official bloc. Some are talking about having a BRICS currency. And I don't know if that'll actually ever happen. But the idea is that, to compete in a world of imperialist powers, you need to organize as blocs, whether they're real or imagined.
The problem why I find the social or the term global South a bit problematic is because it is being overused and consumed in academia and media, especially recently. We talk about all of these countries as kind of one thing. I know it happens unintentionally, but I mean, when I think about studying, especially from an academic approach, from an academic perspective, when it comes to studying our own communities, shall we, as people of certain countries, study our own communities, or do we have kind of the privilege just because we share certain complex history with other countries? Do we have the permission to study others? What difference would it be from if we compare ourselves, for example, to Western social scientists coming to our regions and studying us? Like, to what extent are we immune to potentially falling to sort of orientalistic approaches or perspectives to others that we have been placed under one umbrella with?
Yeah, so I think there are two different questions there. One, well, of course, we can study our own societies because we belong there. And the question of how we study, where do we get the permission to study each other's societies? But the real question there is, how did we get the permission to study our own society? And the answer is, we were given permission by the West. With the development of area studies in the 1970s, when they realized it was cheaper for them to actually bring international students and then send them back to their home countries, train them in theory, and then send them back to their own countries to do field work and write reports, than training American scholars, because there was a lot of investment in language training, cultural training, and so forth. So our permission to narrate was actually given to us by the American Academy, but they never gave us permission to study each other. Right? So that's the permission we have to take. We should do it without permission, actually. And actually, it's something that I come across quite often, where people, I was born in India, and people assume very often that my research is in India. It's just because you can only, white people can do whatever they want, but then the native can only study himself or herself. Right?
Yeah,
that is the assumption.
To stay confined to your own geography.
Right. And my dissertation advisor, Niloufar Hayri, she's Iranian, and she used to research in Egypt. This is the late 90s. And I asked her, well, how did you get away with it? And she said, well, they didn't know the difference between Iran and Egypt. That's how I got away with it.
Wow.
So yes, the native can study his or her own society, but they were given permission. But for the natives to study other natives, we were never given that permission. And I don't think we should wait for it. I think we should just do it.
But when it comes to looking to this north-south contrast and the development of social sciences itself as a field, it has been like the academic discourse is being dominated by the Northern epistemology. So when it comes to studying ourselves, we are already being fed so much about ourselves for decades. And we have already adopted a lot of these stereotypes, whether about ourselves, our own communities, or our even neighboring communities. So when it comes to either studying ourselves or studying others around us, or maybe thousands of miles away, but they belong to the same label of the global south, I think it is very easy for us to adopt these stereotypes. Don't you think so? Like, it is very easy for us to fall within the same traps. Like,
Absolutely.
Do you agree or don't?
Yeah, I'm absolutely. But I agree. No, you said it perfectly. It's very easy to fall into those traps.
So
but
how
also
do
that's
we
not.
resist them then?
But it's also important to say that they weren't wrong about everything. I mean, they were even if you read Orientalism, which I guess you have probably multiple times. Said is actually in awe of the Orientalists. Like he really respects them. He sees them as racist and so forth, which most of them were, not all of them. But he's also kind of in awe of their work. And especially if you look at his section on Luis Massignon towards the end, it's just oozing with respect and veneration. So they were wrong about a lot of things, but they were also right about a lot of things. And anthropology specifically, and this is different from history or philology or linguistics. The people that Said was really interested in were not anthropologists, also authors and painters and so forth. But the interesting thing about anthropology is that it is the science of the other. So there has to be an otherness of some sort, maybe not this colonial relation, but there's always either a gender otherness or a class otherness, right? I mean, a lot of the people doing very great work, anthropological work, from within a given society in the global south are removed totally by class, which is as real as any other marker of difference. So that without that otherness, for better or worse, anthropology is the study of the other. How you define and construct the other is it's a complicated matter, but there has to be that otherness of some kind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And to answer your question directly, I'm sorry I went on a kind of a tangent. How do we resist this? And it's what I said before: is to take non-Western epistemologies seriously. Again, not to discount the Greeks. I love the Greeks, no, but let's also take classical Sanskrit philosophy seriously. Ibn Rushd, Ibn Arabi, Al-Farabi, they should be taken as seriously as the Western philosophers.
Taking these names seriously sounds very appealing, especially when it comes to thinking about what could actually come out of it, like how much we have missed for ignoring all of these names. But at the same time, the accumulation of knowledge is sort of arbitrary, actually. Well, there is the webs of power, of course, play a big role in what dominates and what doesn't. But at the same time, we have been lacking this accumulation of knowledge due to colonization and due to the construction of the modern state, to importing all of these new adopted educational systems. So we lack the accumulation of knowledge that would help us actually make use of all of these names that we are trying to bring back in reality. And also, these names are mainly Arab names. To what extent are they relevant to non-Arab societies when it comes to studying them from the social scientist perspective?
Yeah, very interesting questions. So one, I think this accumulation of knowledge is actually a diversity of knowledge. So in the humanities and social sciences, and I imagine in all sciences, diversity of thought and ideas makes possible a richer analysis. The more philosophies you have, the more theory you have, because also we don't, in philosophers do this, but anthropologists, we don't invent concepts. We take concepts that already exist and make assemblages out of them, which we call theory. And then we apply it to certain situations to make sense out of them and see what relevance they have for society at large. So the more concepts you have, actually the richer assemblage you can make and the richer analysis you can make. So what relevance do these ancient Arab names of old dead men have? We have to also, not to be romantic about it, but for a few centuries there, Arabic was what English is today. It was the language of science and philosophy they had a pretty good run there for several centuries. So when Oxford opened, you had to know Arabic to teach at Oxford. It was a requirement. Like when you get a job at Ibn Khaldun University, they probably ask you to speak English. You have to a B1 or a C1 or something. And it was the same with Arabic in the medieval European world. Arabic is also a classical language of Europe, and they will never admit it, but Arabic was the language of the Iberian Peninsula for almost 800 years, which is longer than the modern Spanish state or the modern Portuguese state. So the classical language of Southern Europe, or a big part of Southern Europe, was Arabic. So when we're talking about these old dead Arab philosophers, we're not talking about this reduced Arabic world. We're talking about the wider extent, the wider reach of Arabic in the medieval world, and also as is well known, and I'm sure you know this very well, it was also part of the Mediterranean world to which the Greek philosophers belonged. Greek philosophy was preserved in Arabic translation, and people like Al-Farabi and Ibn Rushd wrote very important commentaries on them that were later rediscovered by the Europeans. This is a well-known story. But when we tell this story, we also forget that Greece was part of the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Greece didn't become European until the 19th century. So,
right.
So when we talk about Ibn Rushd and Al-Farabi and all these, we're actually talking about the same Mediterranean world, which had different languages. Greek was one. If you get into Christianity, you can make the case that it was written in Greek, but Aramaic and so forth played an important role. Mm-hmm. Syriac and so forth, and Arabic. So it's the same kind of cultural sphere.
There has been this discussion of decolonizing knowledge and giving tribute to the names that should have been included in the academic discourse in our location, whether in the Arab or the Islamic world. It's actually decades old discussion, but there is no significant improvement in that regard.
I see.
Is it because we're doing it wrong, or is it because we have a problem with actually relevance? Maybe we're living in our own romantic world that we cannot actually see reality the way we should. What do you think?
Wow, your questions are all very, very interesting, and I hope I can answer them adequately in the way they deserve to be answered. So I think two things here. One, it's an economic problem where there are a few, but there aren't many great centers of humanities or social science learning in the Arab world. There are a few, AUB, AUC, which are extremely elite institutions in the local context. Birzeit in Ramallah, it's great. It's emerged in the last 10, 15 years as a great place to study humanities, social sciences, but it doesn't compare in numbers or prestige to the Western institutions. So there is this issue of brain drain, right? Mm-hmm. So, the Western Academy is full of Arab, Iranian, Turkish, Indian students because they don't have places to study in their home countries. So they're kind of interpolated into this Western epistemology.
Can we say that like the global South, global North is being reversed, at least in academia, because now even the attempts to actually take our knowledge seriously is also coming from these Western universities because of the brain drain you've mentioned, also because of the universities are more established. There are less political, economical problems in the global north than the global south. Can we say that, at least from the academic perspective, that the global south, global north, is sort of not necessarily being reversed, or at least changed, or the situation is kind of more fluid? Because, as you said, there are more Muslim or Arab or Iranian, Persian scholars in the global universities that are actually doing more serious work than what's actually happening in local universities. To what extent is decolonizing from below is actually practical?
It's possible, after Indian independence, for example, a lot of the top academics, they didn't. When many people went to study in the UK, a lot stayed, who could have very easily gotten scholarships at the UK, especially the UK institutions. And it was a big nationalist thing for them to know, we're going to stay here, we're going to build a nation, and so forth. That period has kind of gone. I mean, there might be one or two people who still do that, but not as a mass movement. And I think that that needs to happen, where even if the institutions aren't there, where people should say, we're going to stay here and build institutions. But also, I will say the situation is not as bleak. I do see changes. I think a lot of it has to do with the interventions of Tal al-Assad, actually, where you see now in the Western Academy people with degrees from Al-Azhar, for example, which you would have never seen 20 years ago. That someone does a BA at Azhar, where actually it's a good university, and they'll do a PhD in the West, and you see them in faculty positions in the US and the UK. And it's a new development. It's not as widespread as it should be, but it is something you didn't see 20 years ago, where this kind of, I mean, not exactly traditional education, a hybrid education that you get at Azhar, which is kind of a hybrid between a traditional Islamic education and the modern university. It is being recognized. And I think that is a positive development.
I wanted, Arpan, to ask you about your own interest. You're not only interested in the margins of the world, but also the margins of the margins, because you've worked on minorities, and your main concern, like in terms of location, is Jordan and Palestine. I wanted to know why specifically, like why minorities and why in these specific locations?
I don't like to use the term minority.
Okay.
I actually never use it, although it's understandable. It's a sufficient placeholder term. But I think many groups in the region don't see them as much. For example, Coptic Christians in Egypt have long held the position that we're not minorities in Egypt. They might actually be only 10%, but we're not a minority because we're essential to Egypt. So how can we be a minority? So a lot of the groups my PhD research was with Romani people in Palestine and Jordan, and this was a word they never used to describe themselves. And actually, most groups that would be classified as minorities in the language of Western liberalism is not used by these groups themselves. They use all kinds of other terms that don't exactly match up to the terms that exist in English in the West. When you say aqaliya, minority, I've never heard a Romani person say aqaliya, or a Bushnak say we're aqaliya, or a Sherka say we're aqaliya. They're just a part of this region, and they're different. They're different from other people, but they're different terms, and each term comes, I think, with different sensibilities. So I don't use this term minority, although, like I said, it's a sufficient placeholder term. And we can talk more about this. But to answer the other part of your question, I didn't choose Palestine. Palestine chose me somehow.
Interesting. How?
It was never a conscious decision. Well, I've been interested in Palestine for most of my adult life. We're to 2024. I guess I discovered Palestine, and it must have been 2004. It's 20 years. I mean, this December will be my 20th anniversary of being obsessed with Palestine. And it happened through Mahmoud
Wow.
Darwish. And I was always interested in art and literature and music. And I grew up, I was born in India, but we immigrated to the US when I was 8. So I was a teenager during the second Intifada in the US, and it was always in the news. And I didn't really know what any of this was. What is this? I had nothing to do with I had nothing to do with any of it. And I knew the basic outline, but I had a hard time making sense of it as a teenager. And then when I discovered Mahmoud Darwish, it was like, okay, something is happening in Palestine, and I need to figure it out. So this is kind of how it started. But it wasn't a conscious decision.
How did you discover Mahmoud Darwish? Like being a teenager, an immigrant in the US, and getting to know Mahmoud Darwish and actually being invested in Palestine. It's a very interesting story that I really would like to know how the bond of it.
I was in a bookstore in New York City, and just kind of flipping through, I came across, there was a very famous Kashmiri poet, Shahid Ali, who translated one of Mahmoud Darwish's poems. So he also, also because of the Intifada and because of this affective global South tie between Kashmir and Palestine. Kashmiris really see themselves in Palestine. He would always mention Mahmoud Darwish and Palestine in his poems, but he translated this one particular poem, Ahad Ashar Kawkaban. He called it, he took some poetic license and he translated the title as 11 Stars over Andalusia, although it's not really an accurate translation of the title. And he included this in one of his books. And this is a poem that Mahmoud Darwish wrote, I believe, in 1992. And this poem makes a very poetic analogy between the fall of Granada, which was the last kind of Arab holdout in Arab Spain, when all the other polities had fallen. Granada still held on. So the fall of Granada is really the final exile of the Arabs, or so the story goes. And he has this beautiful image where there's these, I don't know if you know this poem. So the Arabs are leaving Andalusia, and the Romanis, the Qajar, are on their way to Andalusia, and they meet on the road.
Yeah.
In this kind of double movement. And it's an image that struck me immediately. And really, my obsession with Palestine started there. But it never struck me as a place I could actually go to. Like you can go to Mexico, you can go to France. It just didn't occur to me you could actually go to Palestine. And then eventually it just struck me, I can go there. I could go and see what it's like. And I went for the first time in 2012. And by then, I'd already been obsessed for 9 years, and I'd read a lot. I took college courses on Palestine. I started meeting Palestinians. When I was a teenager, I'd never met Palestinians or Israelis, But by then, so I was well prepared intellectually to go to Palestine. And I just started my master's degree at the time. And again, it never occurred to me I could research Palestine. It was just not something I saw as possible, or even study Arabic. It never, like me speak Arabic, doesn't make any sense. But yeah, it happened kind of on its own. There wasn't a moment
where you didn't
yeah.
only go to Palestine and study Palestine. You actually chose a very specific group to study. What was it? Was it the poem that brought you to Romani Palestinians?
So they came later. I was already going to Palestine for a few years, and I was researching other things. But for the PhD, It was actually somebody I was in. I was somewhere in Ramallah, and this man. And I remember the conversation vividly. He first off he asked me, into Arabic, like he asked me if I'm Arab. I said no. We started talking in English, and somehow we came on the topic of Romani people, and he said, and I'm quoting him exactly. There are gypsies in Palestine. This is his quote, not mine. In Jerusalem, in the old city. And I was like, whoa, what is? And so that night I went home where I was staying in Ramallah, and I Googled it, and there is a Domari society, like a Romani society in Jerusalem, and they have a website. And, it was quite a cutting edge website. And it was not at all like how he had presented them as this kind of mysterious, marginal group. I mean, they're somehow a part of the social fabric of Jerusalem, especially the old city.
Mm-hmm. But so, in context that is very complex, like the Palestinian society, it's very difficult to think of the margin, or not of the margins. I mean, of minorities as groups within the fabric of society. I mean, because the situation there is very tense, because there is a state that is trying to invent and construct, or had been trying to invent and construct a society, a collective, for decades. And in order to emphasize this sense of nation, you need to create very clear difference with who doesn't belong to the nation, or who shouldn't belong to the nation. So the idea of groups and minorities and a society that is scattered all around, whether based on race or document or family origin, or the fact that you're a local, what passport do you hold, to what extent you're native to the town you're living in, are you native or are you a refugee? So how do we say, like, what is the line? Can we actually say that these groups actually belong to the rest of the fabric of society, or within this very tense environment, don't they at the end look inward and consider themselves as a distinct group, sort of?
So I would actually step back before even approaching this question, because I don't think Palestinians have really had the chance to ask themselves, who are we?
Right.
Some have. And the reason is, I mean, we talk about 1948 as a watershed moment, but the first Zionist settlements, I believe the first one was 1878. I have to check. It's, late 19th century, the first four, Petah Tikva and so forth, which is the height of European colonialism. It's also the height of these burgeoning nationalisms in the world. So the Palestinian experience with colonialism began when other places, I mean, there are exceptions, started asking themselves this question of who are we in this colonial moment. And then the official colony, which began in 1948, began also at the height of decolonization, right? So India was decolonized in 1947. And then Israel was founded in 1948. So the timing of Palestine's experience with colonialism made it difficult for them to ask this question of who are we as a collective. And I think this is the reason. So the whole region is full of all kinds of groups, sects, religions, ethnic groups, languages. And I think this richness has been least uncovered in Palestine as compared to, you talk about Iraq with Kurds, Assyrians, Shia, Sunni, or Lebanon with all these, or Syria, all these groups. Palestine is no less diverse than anywhere else in the region. it just never had a chance to articulate this difference, because when your whole peoplehood is assaulted, I mean, the whole Zionist position was that there is no such thing as a Palestinian, right? When your whole peoplehood is at risk of extermination, both literally and also discursively, I think the last thing you want to do is accentuate the differences in the political body. So I think I think they never had a chance to. Only with the Oslo Accords did they actually start recognizing Christian sects, for example. So the only place we actually have official recognition of difference by the Palestinian Authority is with Christian denominations.
Well, I meant to say that in this context, the existence of minorities is inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
Because you started with problematizing the idea of minorities, because at the end, these people they don't see themselves as such. They don't use this wording to describe themselves. But at the same time, within a very tense context, political and social and legal as well, the creation of groups and it's a normal development to at the end you will have minorities, because in a situation like Palestine, Israel, under an apartheid state, apartheid is in its nature uses groups against each other, and minorities always fall victim to these policies. So to what extent can we say that, to what extent can we refer to minorities as minorities, or how shall we deal with these groups if they are minority at the end, at least in an abstract sense, in terms of numbers, and also in terms of their experience of subjugation in this society or under different webs of power?
Right. So it's absolutely true that colonialism uses groups against each other. You even see it in the Israeli state. Certain groups are given preferential treatment, drafted in the military, like Druze, for example. And the Druze in Lebanon, just across the border, can't understand why their brothers and sisters would be doing this, but they are the victims. I mean, they're very sad victims of the Zionist project, where they're used by this way and to turn on their fellow Palestinians. And that's also true for some other groups. But the reason I'm so resistant to this concept of minority is because it has a certain genealogy in Europe that doesn't speak to the experience of this region. So you have to remember, Europe, until the Reformation in the 16th century, didn't tolerate anything besides the Pope, besides Catholicism. It was, one king, one religion. That's it. I mean, only with the Reformation you have this birth of liberal politics, because you have another competing religious sect, the Protestants, who very quickly get all kinds of political power. That was never the case in the Middle East, the Arab world, whatever you want to call it. Because first of all, there was a place for non-Muslims from the very beginning, going back to the Constitution of Medina, right? And the different rights that Christians and Jews have always had under the Ottoman Empire, for sure. So it was always a place for other groups. And it's also important to remember that a lot of these places in the Muslim world were not Muslim majority until relatively recently. Palestine wasn't Muslim majority until probably the 13th century, after the Crusades, after Salah ad-Din. Egypt was probably around the same period. So it was never about majority minority. It was about political power and public life. So it has a very different genealogy of this concept. A minority is someone who lives under a majority. This is not the trajectory of this region.
Okay, but living under, in a post-colonial context, how do you deal? At least tell me from your experience, how do you deal with I don't know if I don't call them minorities, what shall I call them?
Yeah, because with minority, you're already putting them in a position of disempowerment,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's this majority, and the majority is always tyrannical, of course. This is the nature of the majority.
And
And
what if they are disempowered anyway by the law, by the state, by politics?
but are
Because
they?
this
Why
is
should
the
they de facto
reality.
be? Why should they de facto be disempowered?
Looking at how modern states function, and in order to create a unified nation and a unified spirit, they will inevitably be margins and marginalized groups because they don't fully fit within the bigger picture.
Again, I think this is the vision of the state that I'm trying to argue against.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, this is the liberal state with the. It comes out of the Reformation and so forth. That for centuries didn't tolerate any kind of otherness, and then all of a sudden they discovered otherness. They drafted liberal constitutions and imposed it on the rest of the world. Many times, minorities or groups that would be minorities don't want this minority status. Again, the case of Coptic Christians, I think now they do, after 100 years of kind of having it forced upon them. But historically, they didn't want this. Sometimes when you articulate a minority group, it actually makes it not only worse but dangerous for them, which happened in Yugoslavia. When you recognize, when you give a group minority status and enshrine them as an official other, right? You have all this legal status of not being like everybody else. You become expendable. You become genocidable. You become transferable, eliminatable. And this happened, and the progressives in former Yugoslavia, for example, they were always against these national categories. We're Yugoslavs, and that's it. Which was also, by the way, basically the position of Arab nationalism, where we're just Arabs and khalas, like this is it. But some groups do want recognition, so it's a complex issue. But we should not de facto adopt this model of the liberal state with majority-minority politics, because I think the region has had a very different trajectory historically.
Yeah, but as a social scientist, how do you address these groups in a way that doesn't disempower them, but at the same time give them the attention that they need to have? Because marginalization is at the end, it's a process. It has the dynamics of marginalization. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. Like, it doesn't happen just because these people decided to live on the margins of society. It's because there is different layers of or different webs of power that contributed to this situation. So as social scientists, where is the line between not hyper-victimizing a certain group, but at the same time, and sound disempowering, but at the same time, properly representing it?
Yeah, again, the question is representing them under what circumstances as a political bloc, right? So, we are the Kurds, and we want a political voice in the Turkish parliament. I think the history of the region is much more complex. As a social scientist, I try to use categories of how thinkers from the region themselves theorize difference. And one that I always come back to, and it might sound absurd because it's so old, but I think it still has some value, is how Ibn Khaldun thought of society, which is one that is divided. And it's not perfect, it has a lot of problems, but it's interesting to think with. Do you know what I'm going to say?
Please.
He had this, maybe you know this three-tier system of society of falahin, which we normally translate as peasants. And I used to also, but I decided that it's not a very good translation. because peasantry, again, assumes European standards of agricultural communities who are landless, living under feudal lords. But in the Bilad Asham, anyway, farmers, actually, they were landowners. So let's just say agricultural communities, not peasants. So Falahin, agricultural communities, Bedouin, and then Ahl Mudun, the city people. If you look at the anthropology of the Middle East, for example, especially Palestine, until the Nakba, it holds up. This is how Palestinians kind of thought of themselves. So the Bedouin, you can make an argument it's an ethnic group or whatever, and tribal lineages and so forth. But the city dwellers and the Falahin are some of the most diverse groups on the planet. I mean, the villages, you had people from Circassians, Bushnak, Bosnians, all kinds of religious groups, Chechens, you name it, right? Also, these families with the last Al-Turki, Al-Afghani, Al-Hindi, Al-Masri, which denotes an some kind of external origin. These are the communities of, and this is all over the Arab world, not just Palestine, right? So where does the concept of this minority against the majority come up when, first of all, you have this three-part division of Falahin, Bedouin, and city dwellers, and the city dwellers and the Falahin are actually so cosmopolitan, right? They're very cosmopolitan societies. So again, I really push back against this idea of minority, and also what this, even if you use it as a placeholder term, what does it actually do here? Because again, the peasants, the agricultural communities themselves were very different in terms of their economic standing and rights, property ownership in this region than they were in Europe. We need to come up with a new vocabulary, basically, to talk about the diversity, which we've tried to do in this book, Naseej, by the way.
The book is about difference, I understand.
Right. So this is a book that a colleague of mine, Nuda Salahuddin, and I are co-editing. It'll be out in Arabic first, very soon, in September, possibly October, and then in English it'll be out in March. And it's an invitation to think about some of these things we've been talking about this concept of difference, about minoritization, about plurality, about diversity in Palestine, but without being attached to any of these labels, because of this assault on Palestinian peoplehood from the late 19th century onwards, with major ruptures in 36, 48, 67, 2023, 2024. These questions were never properly asked. There are some exceptions. There were certain movements in Palestinian intellectual history where people did try to grapple with it, and they tried to draw a genealogy from the ancient Canaanites and so forth. But on the whole, it's not a question that Palestinians have had the privilege of asking, or the opportunity to ask, of who are we? What is our body politic, so to speak? So Naseej, this book, Naseej meaning woven fabric or tapestry in Arabic, takes for granted that there is this host of diversities in Palestine, also elsewhere, but we're talking about Palestine in this book. We have to make the cut somewhere. And it's an experience of difference that, we say it's a difference that's just there. It's a difference that you encounter every day. You're interacting with all kinds of people all the time. And it's just kind of not a big deal. It's an experience of the social that is woven into the fabric itself, to the extent that you don't have to announce yourself, oh, by the way, I'm an Ahmadi, or I'm Black, or, it's just, it's woven into the nature of the social itself. And it's very different from how this issue of difference has developed and is articulated in the West, where it's your social identity, right?
Mm.
And it's not the case in Palestine and arguably elsewhere in the region. Maybe you will disagree.
Well, I wanted to know why looking at Palestinian society through this particular lens, like why is it relevant? Why is it important in terms of everything that is happening, in terms of the struggle of Palestinians defining themselves, in terms of there's plenty of divisions, political, social, and so on, economic perhaps as well. To what extent it is helpful?
And the reason I think it is important is because I don't think it creates new divisions. I think there is a beauty in it, an immense beauty in the diversity of Palestine, and a sadness in how this diversity has been reduced by colonialism and modernity, and now is actually on the verge of eradication. Many of the Romani families I work with, and one of whom are basically my family. I was telling this the other day. I spend, when I'm in Palestine, I just spent the Eid with them. They're from Gaza, and they're at literal risk of eradication, not just discursive risk of eradication. So I think I wish I could contribute in other ways. I know people from Germany who have gone to Gaza as doctors. I'm not a doctor. I am not an engineer. I can't do many things that are actually useful in moments of catastrophe. But this is something I can do: is be an anthropologist and do anthropology. So I hope it's helpful in some way to preserve some of this beauty and diversity. That is, I think I have very intimate knowledge of a certain society. In this case, it's Palestinian society, but it could have been, any other society. And this intimate knowledge in a way that nobody else has. And I think it's my job to protect that intimacy and cultivate it and make it communicable for others. I think this is my contribution.
Being an anthropologist in Palestine, at least tell me about your research or your upcoming book on Romani Palestinians.
Right. So this book will be published in October. It's my first monograph. It's based on my PhD research, which I researched for about 6 years. It's about the place of the family. And each house is a family. By house, I mean families. So this is the family that is very well educated. They're very chic. This is a family. This is a Christian family. This is the family that came from Hebron, so we don't deal with them. This is a family that made their riches in America, and so forth. And the Romani family is another type of family in this world of families. So it's taking the family as the unit of analysis, not race or ethnicity or religion or other possible configurations. So this is the basic argument, and the premise of the book is, if you go back into Palestinian cultural production, novels, films, music, poetry of Mahmoud Darwish and others, the Romani is always there. You go to the top writers, musicians. There's if you know a group called Sabrin, which is considered the best Palestinian music band from the 90s. They have a song Al Nuri. If you look at writings by, has a poem about Romani people, and so forth. The late 1980s, early 1990s, this Romani character in Palestinian cultural production disappears and does not come back. And why does that
Interesting.
happen? I think there are various reasons. One is that this is when the Intifada starts, the first Intifada, which is so totalizing that you kind of don't have you don't have discursive space for
I
Romanis
see.
and these groups as such. And the other thing, which I think is probably more important, is that so there in Palestine there were two main, before 1948 they were absolutely everywhere, but after 48 you had kind of two main concentrations of Romani people, one in Gaza and one in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, Romanis settled into permanent housing in the 1960s at the end of the 67 war. Whereas in Gaza, that didn't happen until the 1980s. So once the Gajar, the Romanis, moved out of tents and into apartment buildings, people stopped seeing them publicly. And so they disappeared from the public imagination. But privately, Romanis are still, they have a high rate of cousin marriage. I mean, over 90%, I would say. I mean, there's no official statistic, but I would say it's over 90% of cousin marriage. So you're reproducing the Romani identity within the family through the institution of marriage. So privately, the family remains very much Romani, although they disappear from public life and in the public imagination. So this is where the family becomes a unit of analysis and a unit of difference, because the family knows they're Romani. They're very proud, and there's no question. But you don't see that difference being performed publicly. And arguably, this is also the case with many other groups in Palestine, like the Bushnak and the Sherkas, and even groups who are no longer, so for example, in Palestine, you have certain families who are known to have converted from Judaism in the late Ottoman period. There are a few families in Nablus and a few families in Hebron. But there's nothing that remains of this Jewish past. And it's totally normal. It's not problematic in any way. It's something that happened long ago, except for the family name. So you see the family name and you know, well, this family, if you know these, and if you're in touch with these kind of cultural markers, well, this family, they were Jewish 200 years ago. So this is, and that marks that family as different, you see, as much as any other thing like religion or language or ethnicity and so forth. So here, the family is really the unit of difference.
Very interesting. So how is looking at difference different from looking through the lens of minoritization? I
think it is an attempt to use the categories you find in the field. Because again, I don't find this term minority, aqaliya, in the field, except for these very specific kind of policy implementations, starting with the Oslo Accords, where Christians are recognized again. Besides that context, it never comes up. I don't think I heard this word in my, all these years. I think I heard it once, ever, this term aqaliya in the field.
So it doesn't exist in society, but it exists in the political, legal, and maybe media rhetoric.
Exactly. Yeah.
How are non-Western epistemologies utilized or implemented when studying such phenomena of difference in society? I mean, in the region, from your own perspective, like what did you do?
Yeah, so I'm really influenced by, I think I mentioned him earlier, Ashish Nandi, who is an Indian. He was trained as a psychologist, but he's really just a social critic and public intellectual. I borrow his idea of mnemonic societies or mnemonic cultures, and I put him into conversation with another. He's really a performance studies scholar, D. Venkat Rao, and I see them as kind of having a conversation. Although Nandi does many things, this is just one small part of his body of work. And basically what this constellation of critique proposes is that there are basically two kinds of societies in the world.
Okay.
One are lithic societies, lithic meaning societies that inscribe in stone. So the Judaic tradition is very much this. So think of, for example, God gives Moses the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, or as we call it, Jabal Musa in Sinai. And God writes the Ten Commandments literally onto these stone tablets. So that communication from God is literally written down instantly, right? And this is the kind of cultural tendency that tends to archive, tends to write, record, archive everything in a material sense, right? The other kind of society is one that has a mnemocultural or mnemonic pulsion, which is not written down, and it's also not exactly oral, although that is also, something that exists, but it's actually something that is remembered, and it emerges, or it's revealed, it's articulated in very slight and subtle ways, and only if one knows where to look. So, for example, what I said a little while ago about these families from Hebron and Nablus that converted from Judaism. This whole history of Judaism in Palestine before Zionism is carried in their last name, in the family name.
Yeah.
Right. It's not saying we were Jews and Jews were here and everything was fine. It's actually just the last name. So this is the mnemonic. But you have to know how to look, or what to look for this to be revealed. And according to Nandi, all cultures in the world have both of these, but all prefer one or the other. And this is something that possibly Europe had in the past at an earlier stage, and they no longer have it. This tendency to prefer the mnemonic over the lithic. But it's something that is still very much there in the darker continents, in the global south, than in Europe, where this mnemonic pulsion is still preserved. And it's like there are little things that one has to look for. It can even be something so much as a gesture of the hand. I do this while I talk. This is something very Indian, by the way. That you do this gesture, and it doesn't mean anything, but it reveals something about who you are and what you come from. In Indian classical music and also Qawwali, the Sufi music of India and Pakistan, the actual movements that the musician makes, not the actual playing of music, but let's say the rapture of the body and so forth, also has to be learned. You cannot just bop your head in any way. The way you move your body is a part of the musical pedagogy.
Yeah.
So this is also this mnemocultural pulsion, and this is something I talk quite a bit about in my book.
If studying difference actually differ between the North and the South?
Of course. I think, again, because of these different trajectories of how the administration of difference has been, has developed, as I mentioned earlier. It's not like I set out in Palestine knowing that I would be using Ashish Nandi. It happened because I read him. And I think if we read each other, we will start learning from each other's experiences in the same way that Nandi, as I mentioned earlier, learned from Fanon and Senghor. Right? He learned from Senegal and Algeria. So it's a question of reading each other, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about what is it's okay, we keep the Western canon there. We keep the Western epistemology. It's great. But also we introduce other canons, other epistemologies. And this way we actually start to learn from each other's experiences and take them as seriously as anything else.
And how do we deal with each other's otherness then?
I think we find connections in unexpected places. And I recently watched a documentary that actually a colleague of mine here in Berlin made, and it has to do with, it's a fascinating documentary. I think it's called The Sounds of Friendship. And so the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, East Soviet, communist East Germany, had a Hindi service in their national radio. And I think it was only like 4 or 5 people, and they had 2 Indians, and the rest were Germans who studied Hindi at the university, had never been to India. And in a small town in Bihar, which is a very poor state in India, and it's a small town, I'd never heard of it, there was a fan club of this Hindi service that East Berlin transmitted several times a week. And so in the documentary, she interviews the people who were in the fan club, and they would write letters. And she interviews some of the German radio hosts who broadcast in Hindi. And one of the women in the interview, she said something. It really struck me. So she studied Hindi in university. She'd never been to India. Now, Germany, it was reunited in 1989, and in 2009 she went to India for the first time. Many years after the radio program and all this. And she said, I was just struck by how similar Indians are to East Germans.
Wow.
I never thought of it, but, in some ways, despite the cultural differences, I think we are actually very similar. And I never thought I would say this. So I tell you the story, and I apologize for the indirect way I come to it, that you find connections in unexpected places and in unexpected ways. And I think this is also something worth investigating if we're going to live in this planet, is to try to find connections as opposed to taking for granted that we're different and khalas, that's it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of interacting with each other and reading each other, and in light of everything we've spoken about for the last more than an hour, actually, how is all of this relevant to what is currently happening in the world?
I'm convinced that anthropology, but not only anthropology, all the social sciences, humanities, have the potential. It doesn't always work out, but it has the potential for radical understanding. These race riots that are happening in the UK.
Yeah.
And it's also true of, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant right-wing groups in the US and other places. I'm always just kind of surprised at how much they have in common. Poor white people in the US and the UK, they believe in the family, they believe in God, which liberal elites in London, New York usually don't.
Yeah.
And they actually have more in common with Muslim immigrants from Pakistan than they do with people in London. But this false consciousness, this false, in a Marxist analysis, it's superstructure. These things about, Islam, cultural difference. This is superstructure. If you make an economic analysis, this is happening because they're competing over resources. They're competing over jobs. This is why this is happening. And this is an example of if everybody just read Marx, I don't think these things would be happening, because they would understand that actually we're actually very common, and what this is all about is the resources that have been denied to us by politicians and by the state. So this is one example of I think we can actually live in a better world in the best case scenario if we were better trained in the social sciences and the humanities.
Well, that's a big statement. Arpan Roy, it was really fun having you today. It was an absolute pleasure. And thank you so much for giving us this much of your time.
It was more of a pleasure for me. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Arpan. Our dear listeners, thank you very much for staying with us. If there are any guests that you would like to see in our podcast in the next episodes, please feel free to email us. The email is going to be in the description box below or wherever, based on the platform you're listening to us from. And until next time, please take care and see you soon.